This is Zach's at it again. I'm your host, Zach Cooley, and I'm so happy to be here today to be talking with an old friend. Very honored to have best-selling author, national best-selling author, Mark Shaw on the phone. We're going to talk about Marilyn Monroe and Dorothy Kilgallen and JFK and their untimely deaths, and a link to them all in his wonderful new book, Collateral Damage. Thank you so much for being on, Mark. It's an honor to have you.
Well, I have such respect for you, Zach, and so I'm pleased to be on your program for sure.
Well, it's great to talk to you again, and I couldn't wait after I read this book to get into this, because you have really found some things, some interesting things for this new book, and I am very anxious to talk about them. Now, I'll begin with these three books. You and I are pretty spiritual fellas, you know, and you have said in the past that you have felt, because this is the third book that you've written concerning Dorothy Kilgallen, you have felt that Dorothy was sort of spiritually guiding you along the way here with these. I wonder, because of the terrific insight you've gotten on Marilyn Monroe, if you feel her spirit connected in any way with this.
Well, it's been an interesting journey, Zach. I didn't know very much about Dorothy Kilgallen a few years ago. I just knew about her, that she was the star panelist on that CBS show that ran for, I think, 15 years every Sunday night at 10 o'clock Eastern Time. Called What's My Line? Mm-hmm. And as you may recall, they guessed people's unusual occupations, but they had 10 million people watching that show every Sunday night, and so that's the only thing I knew about Dorothy.
That's the only thing I knew. That's the only thing I knew about Dorothy until I found you.
Yeah, exactly. So, as it's kind of meant to be in a life of mine that's filled with with several. Well, really many spiritual situations that have occurred. I learned about her when I was writing a book about a lawyer named Melvin Belli, who was the lawyer for Jack Ruby in the JFK assassination, the assassination of Lee Harvey Oswald. And I knew Belli back in the 80s, and so I wrote a biography of him, and it's called King of the Courtroom. And during that, investigation of Belli's life and times, a friend of his said, "Well, Belli knew Dorothy Kilgallen." And I said, "Well, yeah, from What's My Line?" He said, "Mark, you don't know anything about her. She was a syndicated columnist in New York to 200 newspapers across the country. She was on What's My Line. She had a radio show listened to by 1 million people. She covered the Dr. Sam Shepard case, which became the Fugitive movie. She covered the Lindbergh baby kidnapping case, and she covered the Jack Ruby trial." And that was my entree into what now 4 books, basically, that touch on the JFK assassination. And I must admit, I really was never interested in it until I landed on Dorothy. And so it was most interesting with her. For those people that don't know, she investigated the JFK assassination for 18 months. She was a very close friend of JFK. She didn't buy the Oswald alone theory and all of that. So she wrote all of these columns while she was at the Jack Ruby trial. The Oswald file must not close and all these other things. And then she was the only reporter, Zach, as you may recall, to interview Jack Ruby during his trial. And that's what makes her such a credible source, in terms of what happened back there. And I wasn't there. You weren't there. All these other authors and so-called experts and everything that have commentated on the JFK assassination, they weren't there, but Dorothy was in the front row of that trial. And I think in Collateral Damage, people will see there's a photograph of her in Daley Plaza. There's a photograph of her in the courtroom at the Ruby trial and all of that. So what did she do after she interviewed Jack Ruby? Well, she went to New Orleans And like me, she had always suspected that the main reason that JFK was killed was to render Bobby Kennedy powerless because he had gone after members of the mafia, especially a New Orleans Don named Carlos Marcello. And Dorothy went to New Orleans. She had connected Marcello with Ruby and with Oswald, and she was about to write a book she was in the midst of writing a book for Random House that would expose Marcello as, based on motive, as orchestrating JFK's death, and J. Edgar Hoover for covering it up. And unfortunately, of course, tragically, she was found dead in her townhouse in New York City in 1965, a staged death scene, wearing clothes and makeup and everything to bed she never wore, all of that. But there was no investigation of Dorothy's death, and she kind of disappeared from the face of the earth until I started writing about her, with first the bestseller, The Reporter Who Knew Too Much, and then Denial of Justice. It had the Ruby trial transcripts and everything. So, frankly, I was going to quit, because all during my research about Dorothy and the assassination, I felt like she was my guiding light from above. Now, many people have trouble with thinking that way, and they think I need some mental assistance, but frankly, I just felt her presence. I have a picture of her up here on the wall, and I felt like Dorothy was kind of guiding me along, that she wanted me to be her voice and speak up for her, that she hadn't gotten the justice when she died. So I was going to quit after Denial of Justice, but all at once I had this feeling that Dorothy had more in mind for me. And what happened then is that I decided, a lot of people had asked whether there was a connection between Dorothy's death in 1965 and Marilyn's 3 years earlier in 1962, and I didn't know, and I didn't think there was.
And I believe, if I may interject, these books have, we've never actually met in person, but we've struck up a virtual friendship over the years, if you will.
Right.
And I believe when I first spoke to you about The Reporter Who Knew Too Much, that was one of my questions. Is it connected to Marilyn Monroe? So,
so you were one of them that did that, and so I started looking into it. And in Collateral Damage, people will see, first of all, the first clue that I had, and there's a photograph of Marilyn and Dorothy on the set of a movie called Let's Make Love with Yves Montand, a French actor, at 20th Century Fox, and it's in 1961, a year before Marilyn died in 1962. And they look like they're kind of buddy-buddy, they're friends, and I'd always kind of questioned whether this whole idea of Marilyn Monroe committing suicide was valid. So I thought to myself, well, they were friends. Let me see if Dorothy Kilgallen wrote any columns about Marilyn before she died. And as always seems to happen with my research, and I kind of felt like Dorothy guided me towards a column that she had written about Marilyn just before Marilyn died. And it's in Collateral Damage. People can read it, but just to summarize, it said that, Marilyn Monroe was on the upswing. She was going to parties in Hollywood. And most important, it said, what she wrote, Dorothy did, that she had found a love interest that was a bigger name than Joe DiMaggio. Now, people may remember him as the Yankee Hall of Famer baseball player, and Marilyn was married to him for a time. So I looked at that and I thought, wait a minute, that does not sound like a woman who is suicidal. I then found another column that people will read in Collateral Damage about Marilyn looking for love and that kind of thing. And so I thought to myself, wait, there's something wrong here. And to answer your question, and then we can go forward, yes, I did, and I have felt Marilyn's spirit kind of moving me towards being able to provide, a completely different look at the circumstances under which she died in 1962.
Yes, because there are too many eerie similarities and too many untied ends to the way that they both died, and then to know that they both had, albeit different types of connections, but they both had strong connections to JFK. You can't help but think that it's all interwoven.
Well, what one of the main similarities, I think in the book there's more than 60 similarities between Marilyn and Dorothy, their life and times and their deaths. But the one that really clicked with me is when I decided finally to look at the autopsy for Marilyn and the certificate of death. And you're a curious person and a man of the truth, Zach. I think you would have done the same thing, had the same reaction I did, because when I looked at the autopsy that was was created on the morning after Marilyn died on August 4th, 1962, it had as cause of death overdose of barbiturates.
Mm-hmm.
When I looked at the certificate of death, which was done about 6 hours later in the afternoon, it had probable suicide. So that made me really curious as to what was going on here. And when I looked at the autopsy conducted by somebody that a name that many people remember, Thomas Noguchi, I was just flabbergasted and upset because basically he admitted he made mistakes when he conducted the autopsy to the effect of forgetting to look and inspect certain inner organs of Marilyn's, and by the time he figured out he'd missed those, they had been destroyed. Mm. And with Dorothy's autopsy, the same sort of things happened, to where they were supposed to be only one, according to the autopsy, only one barbiturate in her system. Well, I found documents that showed there were three, which pointed to her being killed because she was the reporter who knew too much. So it was interesting, because then I really came up with the conclusion something's wrong here. Who is this person who is a bigger name than Joe DiMaggio? And I immediately, as I think you would have, tilted my research into looking at JFK, because as most people know, for his 45th birthday, before he died, she ended up at Madison Square Garden, and she sang Happy Birthday to the president at a fundraiser at Madison Square Garden. You can watch that on YouTube.
In a very tardy fashion.
Yeah, she did, and the dress she wore, and so on and so forth. And so I then found a photograph of Marilyn and JFK with Bobby Kennedy at an after-hours party, and I looked at more research, and there was a short love affair between Marilyn and JFK. Of course, JFK was chasing every woman he would meet on a street corner at the time, unfortunately.
Right.
But they had a short little love affair, but that ended very quickly when Joe Kennedy, the father, the patriarch of the family, said, "Hey, that's enough, that we don't need to see you and Marilyn on the front pages." And so I thought, well, who's the next most powerful man? Who's the next bigger name? And that landed me on Bobby Kennedy, and when I started investigating his relationship with Marilyn Monroe, that changed everything.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I wanted to ask you too. You brought up Noguchi. Is that pronouncing it correctly?
Right, exactly.
Yeah. I have seen him on television shows talking about doing other people's autopsies. There's a program called Autopsy even, and he's been interviewed for several different celebrity autopsies. One of them including Natalie Wood, who. The circumstances of whether or not she fell off the boat or whether she was pushed off or what he was involved in that. And every time I see this man, I'm thinking, what planet did he fall off of when I hear his commentary? So so the fact that he was mentioned prominently in the book. And I think at one point, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, like he forgot to look at important things, and then by the time he'd go back, that the organs were destroyed. But
that's right.
But isn't it at one point that he said, "Oh, I just didn't look at that."
Well, it's just tragic. It's malpractice, is what it is. Mm-hmm. And this had happened with Natalie Wood's cases and others. If you want to falsify a murder, or call it, I don't want to call it a murder or whatever, and you want to call it just overdose or whatever, accidental, whatever you want to, just falsify the autopsy. I really believe that Noguchi didn't make a mistake, that he didn't accidentally do that. I think that there was the potential that he was told to go ahead and do as lackadaisical autopsy as possible, just like was done in Dorothy Kilgallen's death. And the result, of course, was that the papers, papers across the country, and at that time television was in its infancy, but basically the headlines were Marilyn commits suicide, Marilyn takes her own life, and all of that. And what that triggers is that there is then usually no investigation of any kind, because people believe what they hear or what they read or what they watch. And if the autopsy basically says, well, we've figured out what happened, then that's the end of the story. The other part of this was that Bobby Kennedy's one of his best friends was the L.A. Police chief, Robert Parker, and Parker never looked into Marilyn's death as he should have. So I started to try to figure out exactly what the real relationship was with Marilyn and with RFK, and I landed upon what usually happens in my investigations, and that is I just strike gold with something. There's something that nobody else has exposed that really makes a great deal of difference. And in this case, it was a 1962 CIA document that was released just before Marilyn died. In fact, the day before she died. And it's in the book. I call it the Rothberg Report, because what it says, Zach, as you know, is that there were phone taps put on the phones of Dorothy Kilgallen with a friend of hers named Rothberg in New York, and they're the results of those conversations in there. But the ones I looked at more than anything were that there were wiretaps of conversations between Marilyn Monroe and Robert Kennedy. And what it showed was basically that Marilyn Monroe put herself in danger because she had had enough of both of the Kennedys. They both had dumped her. RFK had done so after this love affair that he had. And so she was so upset, and she basically said, as according to the document, I'm going to the media. I'm going to call a press conference and tell all about my relationships with the terrible Kennedys. I'm going to expose, and this is the one that ended up causing her death, her murder. She said, I'm going to tell the media about JFK's intentions to have Fidel Castro killed, assassinated. Mm-hmm. Well, if you can imagine, going to the media with things like that would have destroyed both the Kennedys' futures, because it's one thing to talk about the love affairs, but if you go ahead and talk about matters of national security being leaked to her, which is in some ways treason, that would have been the end of the Kennedys for sure. That document also talks about the torrid love affair between Marilyn and RFK in the summer of 1962, right, to the extent, Zach, that he had promised Marilyn that he would divorce Ethel and marry Marilyn. And so you can just imagine that she was so upset with regard to what was going on. These two men had kind of used her, and she was going to get back at them. And then I looked into seeing, okay, how can I prove that Bobby Kennedy, who would have the greatest motive, and I always look at motive as a former criminal defense lawyer, I always look at motive, how would he have, if he wanted to silence Marilyn Monroe, how would he orchestrate her death? And that led me to, finding proof that that's exactly what happened.
Well, I would like to touch on too. You mentioned in the book, and I find this very profound, the mafia was in control of the major medical examiner's office in New York and Los Angeles, in all of these places where these people, these celebrities, happened to be examined when they pass away suddenly, and that would include Marilyn Monroe and Dorothy. Secondly, Marilyn Monroe was not the dumb blonde who was nothing more than a sex symbol. She was very smart, and she kept notes, as I read in your book, not just about the affair, but conversations she was let in on about the UFOs and the space program and the Cuban Missile Crisis and Castro. This was not a dumb woman, and it's very ironic that I said we were just having a casual conversation, my wife and I don't know how we got on the subject of Marilyn Monroe, but I said Marilyn. I made a very blanket, dumb statement. I said Marilyn Monroe had only one thing going for her, and that's that she was beautiful, and you know, she was not a singer. She was not a good singer. She was not a good actress, in my opinion. But my wife said, "Oh no." My wife said, "Oh no." Said Marilyn Monroe was very smart, and she knew exactly what to do to get herself to the top. And then I read your book, and I find out all these things. So,
well, the situation with Marilyn, there's so much, you know, I really look at distortions of history. You know, I have a little, and especially when it involves justice, I have you probably read it in the book, I have a motto over here on the wall, a quote: "The dead cannot cry out for justice. It is the duty of the living to do so for them." And so that's me. I become the voices for my subjects, including Marilyn and Dorothy. The mafia being involved in these medical examiner's office was clear in New York City, not as clear in Los Angeles, but frankly, still they were not going to go after, do any investigation of Marilyn's death. They just decided she was suicidal, and that was the end. As far as Marilyn goes, you know, looking into her death and her life and times, I'm going to disagree with you about one thing. First of all, you're right, and your wife is right. She was very, very smart. You can find poems by her in the book. You can, in Collateral Damage. You can find notes that she wrote. You can find, you know, the woman was a voracious reader. She tried to read a book, for God's sakes, of Ulysses, which I tried to read one time and couldn't. She was a very smart person, and she was very careful. Of course, she was like Dorothy at a time when gender discrimination was very strong, as unfortunately it is today at times. But Marilyn, you know, did what she had to try to get to the top. But at one point, finally, she was starting to get the respect that she deserved. And just before she died, that respect had really become strong. She had taken classes. She had become a much better actress. Go watch The Misfits, I would suggest to your audience, with Clark Gable. You'll see a different Marilyn Monroe than you've ever seen before.
I actually have seen The Misfits, and that is a good movie. That is definitely
absolutely, and you can just see her expand. And right before she died, Dorothy knew that Marilyn had received offers to be in a Broadway play. She was receiving more movie offers. All of these things were happening. She just bought a new house. She had everything going for her, and unfortunately, of course, she was silenced. And what I was able to show in the book was, and people can, I always like to know what their reactions will be, but Bobby Kennedy at that particular time was madly in love with Marilyn. I showed that he was in Los Angeles in 1962 before she died, and actually that he was in Los Angeles on the very day that she died. I had credible evidence that he landed in a helicopter from San Francisco over in at the 20th Century Fox movie lot. He and Peter Lawford, his brother-in-law, and then a policeman for the Beverly Hills Police Department stopped a car with RFK and Peter Lawford later in the night after Marilyn died. And I'm not going to give it away because I want people to make up their own mind, but I've given what I believe is a very plausible scenario as to Peter Lawford and RFK going to Marilyn's home on the afternoon she died and tried to talk her out of going to the media, which she refused. And then Bobby was able to orchestrate the end for Marilyn, unfortunately silencing her at such an early age of 36. But
my age now, by the way.
Well, good. See, you're such a young man.
Oh, well, I don't know. I don't feel that way, but thank you.
Well, you should. You should. I'm almost 77, and I feel like a young man. So you're only 36. You've got to feel like.
Oh no,
But one of the things I did in the book, and I hope you saw that toward the end, is to humanize Marilyn, Dorothy, and JFK.
Absolutely.
Because I wanted people to know what they were all about. And what I did is to try to show what we lost when they died and what they lost when they died. So, for instance, Marilyn intended to remarry Joe DiMaggio and perhaps have a child with him. That never happened. We lost one of the greatest actresses to have ever appeared on the big screen. Dorothy Kilgallen, the mother of three. She never got to enjoy, the time she could have spent with her children. Mm-hmm. And we lost one of the greatest reporters who ever lived, the most powerful female voice in America. The New York Post called her incredible wordsmith. Just all of that, as people will see in Collateral Damage. And then, of course, JFK never got to enjoy time with little John, and Caroline as they grew up. And JFK, who knows what he would have done as President of the United States. So there were three tragedies here within 40 months of each other. Marilyn 62, JFK 63, and Dorothy in 65. And none of them received the justice they deserved when they died.